Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Marissa Lepore. I'm a member of the 3G board at the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles, the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States founded by survivors. We were founded in 1961 by survivors who wanted to create a safe space to display their precious artifacts, to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished, and to educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from across Los Angeles, the US, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you for joining us for today's program, If You Heard What I Heard. If You Heard What I Heard is a recently launched collection of interviews with grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, recounting the harrowing journeys, devastating losses, and inspiring resilience of their grandparents. This is the first project to focus on capturing the stories of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the last generation to hear survivor stories firsthand. So we're so happy that you can join us for a conversation with If You Heard What I Heard interviewees, Dina, Aaron, mother-in-law duo Molly and Vivienne, and project founder Carolyn, as they share their family stories and discuss the importance of carrying the torch of Holocaust education forward for the next generation. We're so excited to have you guys here with us today. Thank you for joining. I'll introduce everyone briefly, but Carolyn Siegel is the founder and CEO of strategic marketing agency Summer Monday and the creator of If You Heard What I Heard. Dina Grimshaw is an educator and the granddaughter of Holocaust survivor Miriam Bell, one of the founders of Holocaust Museum Los Angeles. Aaron Aftergood is an attorney in Southern California. Molly Stern is a makeup artist and the mother of Vivienne, who is a high school student. And I'm Marissa Lepore. I'm on the 3G board of the Los Angeles Museum of Holocaust Museum Los Angeles. The 3G board is a board comprised entirely of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Before we get started, please note that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the program. You can ask a question by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So it is now my pleasure to start the conversation. I'll just start it off with Carolyn. Can you begin by telling us about the origins of If You Heard What I Heard?
Yeah, first, Marissa, thank you so much for having us all here tonight. It's such an honor to be here with you and participate in this program with the Holocaust Museum of LA, a museum that holds a special place, I think, for all of us. And we are really beyond honored to be here with you. So thank you. Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about If You Heard What I Heard. A while ago, there was a synagogue near the Grove that was graffitied. And I know the Grove is not too far away from where the museum is. And that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement a while ago. And I remember thinking, what, this is like the 5th or 6th incident this year that I've heard about. And this was in 2020. So
That was actually my grandparents' synagogue. So it
was, yeah. So, you know, yeah, it like really hits close to home. And I just felt like these incidents were becoming more prevalent. And I think for a lot of us when we were growing up, it just felt like these anti-Semitic incidents weren't happening with as much frequency as they're happening now. And I thought about, well, if more people today maybe knew what, heard what I heard over the course of decades of my life, a story here, a story there, but beyond that could see and feel the pain that my grandfather spoke about when he told me these stories, maybe we wouldn't see these incidents happening as frequently. But not only that, I think, sharing the stories of survivors, these are people who survived. So the fact that I'm here today, that Molly, Vivienne, Dina, Aaron, that we're here today, we are living proof of their resilience. And I thought about, what exists for today's generation to really make these stories relate in the same way that I heard them. So, I think it's really hard to, watch a video that was filmed 25 years ago versus being in a room with a survivor. But we are their legacy going forward. We're the ones that are going to carry that story forward. So I thought about, well, what if I filmed people like me, that are theoretically still kind of young and cool, right? And like, if you heard our stories and maybe you found out about it through social media and all the digital tools we have today, maybe we can make a real impact and relate these stories on a personal level so that these anti-Semitic incidents don't happen, but also so that we don't forget about these incredible stories of strength and resilience.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And thanks so much for doing that. Maybe can each of you begin by telling us a bit about your family stories? I know you could probably spend the whole panel talking about each of your grandparents, but maybe just so that everyone has a little bit of context on what you guys, the stories that you guys would share in if you heard what I heard interviews, we can start off with Molly and Vivienne, and then I'll just call each of you out.
Hi, thank you so much, Marissa, for having us. And Carolyn, thank you so much for including us in this amazing project. We are very, very honored to be here. Very honored that my father, Vivienne's grandfather, is watching this. So that's awesome also. So thank you for the opportunity. My father is a Holocaust survivor. My grandfather and grandmother are Holocaust survivors, born in Budapest, Hungary. And yeah, they have a story like so many survivors do of just really crazy happenstance luck that kept them alive and kept them going and able to carry on their legacy.
I mean, yeah, I know more of my grandfather's story more than my great-grandparents' story, but I just know that it's just hearing the stories of how within a second, it's a miracle that's what it is, being a survivor. And so it's just, I feel like that's something that I've heard my whole life, is just the miracles that took place to then lead to myself being here.
We sort of grew up with stories our whole life. Oh, my father's a Holocaust survivor. Oh, it was just sort of part of the fabric of our conversation growing up. And it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago that my father went back to Hungary and created a family tree for us to see. And I really understood what those words meant. My father's family died in the Holocaust, of how many branches of a family tree, what that really looked like. I had never really understood it. I just sort of repeated the information over and over again. And it's staggering to see how many generations were lost per person that were killed in the Holocaust.
Thank you. Maybe Aaron next.
Sure. Good evening and thank you. My name is Aaron Aftergood. On my father's side, I am the grandchild of two survivors, both Polish. My grandfather, Edgar Aftergood, was in the Warsaw Ghetto as a teenager. My grandmother was born in Krakow, but actually spent most of the war years in the what would become the Soviet Union. The story that I was primarily interviewed about for this project was my grandfather's story, but both of my grandparents have amazing stories of survival and reinvention at every step of the way. They eventually met in Paris after the war as young adults, and then eventually came to Los Angeles, where my father was born. My grandfather, like I said, was in the Warsaw Ghetto. His aunt was actually ran a children's hospital there. And so they were greatly helped by the fact that he and his parents occupied sort of a small apartment within the hospital building. So he was, able to benefit from some of the infrastructure that existed there, but also witnessed some of the horrors that were part of being connected to a hospital there. But throughout it all, he maintained a positive outlook. He was a violinist and performed concerts with an orchestra of Jewish musicians within the ghetto. And he survived with his father. Most of the rest of his family did not survive, but he and his father did survive by essentially escaping from a work crew that used to leave the ghetto every day just for the day and then return. He was able to arrange for a guard to look the other way as he and his father wandered off, and that was the start of several months of running and hiding, and eventually surviving the war. So maybe I'll leave it there and we can come back to it, and we'll hear from Dina.
My turn?
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dina. So similar to what Erin was saying, and I think even mentioned that, to me growing up, it was just kind of something that I always knew. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. It kind of just rolled off the tongue. And for a lot of my life, I don't think I ever even really thought about what that meant until I started to learn more about it in school myself, and then became a teacher and started to teach about the Holocaust and wanted to ask more questions. And honestly, with this project, I really took the time to do more research before my interview was filmed with Carolyn. So that helped me a lot as well. But I'm actually the granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors, both grandparents on my mother and my father's side. My story with, if you heard what I heard, focused more around my grandmother. So I guess I'll focus on that in relation to the project. But my maternal grandparents, Miriam Bell and Sam Bell, are actually founders of the Holocaust Museum. And my grandmother sat on the board for many years. So I'm very honored to be doing this tonight. So thank you. Her story really is just kind of mind-blowing to me every time I tell it and listen to it or watch my own video. And when she's from Lithuania, from a small town, Kovno, Lithuania, and her town was occupied by the Soviet Union. And they were first sent to live in a ghetto, as Erin was explaining too. And in that ghetto, she saw a lot of awful things. She would leave to try to go find food daily. And from there, she was sent to various camps, a work camp where she helped create ammunition by hand in one of the labor camps. And she was in Stutthof, Poland. She was in Hamburg, Germany. She was in Bergen-Belsen. She was sent around a lot, which is kind of the short story of a lot of it. She witnessed her own father being shot and killed in front of her. She was the 4th of 7 siblings. And right off the bat, they were separated. And she kind of spent a lot of that time not really knowing who was alive and who was not and where they were. It wasn't until 1964 when she then came to LA with my grandfather and found out, I think in 1965, that 2 of her siblings, a brother and a sister, actually were alive. So it took a long time to get to that point. But just like Erin was saying, I think her strength, she was a very strong woman. She listened, but she also stood up for herself. She was resilient. And I think her strength is what got her through all of those experiences with kind of the pride that she had in her family and her religion and the museum, and what she could do as a survivor by not giving up, but continuing to tell the story as much as she could, and by speaking to groups when she could. And a lot of it, I think it's the strength of the survivors, the strength that got them through the, I don't want to say positive attitude, because I don't think they had a positive attitude, but I think just being able to listen. She always told me she listened, and that was one of her talents, was listening they knew she was strong, they knew she was smart, they knew she was listening. And so they knew that she would be good for certain jobs and a hard worker in the labor camp or cooking. And that's what really got her through, was her strength and her resilience, I think, which brought her here in 1965 to then take part in the founding of the museum.
Thank you. And Caroline, as well, your grandparents inspired you to create this initiative. So
yeah, so I'm the granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, and the story that I shared for this project was of my grandfather. My grandfather actually specifically really inspired this project. I remember being 8 years old, and I found a photo of his parents who were murdered in the Holocaust. And it was the first time that I heard his story. I mean, I think like Dina has shared, and a lot of us have shared, there was never a time I didn't know my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. I always knew they were Holocaust survivors, but I never knew what that meant. And I didn't know their stories until I sat down with my grandfather after finding this photo. And he told me about what happened. He actually was studying to become a lawyer before the war and had been in Berlin, Germany, where the Nuremberg laws were passed. And at one point he had shared with me that he heard Hitler speak, and how like just bone chilling and stomach hurtling it was to hear Hitler speak. But he went back to Poland and said to his family, we have to get out of here, we have to leave. They didn't listen. They said, we've experienced anti-Semitism in the past, we'll be fine. And he was proactive about it. He joined the Polish army as a means of like, maybe if I join the army, I can sort of get ahead of this and keep an ear to the ground on what's going on and try to protect my family. Ultimately he and his brother were sent to fight after Germany invaded Poland, and he returned home after the war, and a neighbor that when he returned home had said, your parents were marched to a forest, told to dig their own graves, and shot. His sisters, his brother-in-law, his nephew were sent to Belzec concentration camp. And we never knew what happened to his brother. So my grandfather was the only surviving member of his family. So when I was 8 years old and he's telling me the story, he said, Carolyn, it's your job. You have to make sure future generations remember these stories. You have to make sure the world doesn't forget. And I remember at the time feeling like, what is he talking about? Like, Steven Spielberg's got this. I do not need to worry about this. And here we are, like, we're now 30 years later from when that conversation happened with my grandfather. And so I would say, this project is sort of like, I'm gonna get like start crying talking about this, but like, it's my promise to him to make sure that we don't forget. So I'm trying to honor that.
That's really powerful. And I think we all feel very similarly. Otherwise we wouldn't be here tonight on this panel. But, I think a lot of times when it's really tough when you're talking to someone who maybe learned about the Holocaust for 5 minutes in school and they think that they know it, just like they know about D-Day or some other thing that happened in history. And there's so many things that happen in history that you learn about in school for 5 minutes. And that's the amount of time that you have because there's so much history to learn. But I think a lot of my friends, Jewish or not Jewish, they don't really have the stories that we have because, like the project has said, they didn't hear what we heard. And I think kind of creating that emotional tie to someone, even when you're first sharing the story of the Holocaust, to not share, you can start with the number of people that were murdered and all the facts and figures, but sometimes it's more about the individual story to explain like the severity of how harsh it was. And I think, Carolyn, the story that you just shared is one of those stories that, for someone who hasn't really heard about the Holocaust on like an individual level, doesn't really understand what it means. And there's stories that of my grandparents, whether it was my bubby in concentration camps where it was Yom Kippur, and even though they were starving and were fed, a piece of bread a day and some broth, none of her and her friends ate to honor Yom Kippur. I don't know how they knew it was Yom Kippur. There are certain things in their stories, as I'm sure many of you know, that when you ask a certain question, they don't really remember how this happened or how they knew or et cetera. But when when one of the soldiers noticed that they weren't eating, they asked them why. And whoever spoke up was immediately shot. And when she explained that it was because of Yom Kippur, and the rest they were told that they were obviously being fed too much and needed to fast for 2 days instead of one. And, why would they decide to honor Yom Kippur? Why would they have the hope to do that? Why would this woman have, the courage to stand up? Why would the others? It's just these moments of why, and like the strength of personality and perseverance, I think sometimes build a deeper understanding of what the Holocaust means than all the facts sometimes, or at least in the context of the facts, it adds a different level. I'm curious if anyone else has those stories that maybe they begin to share with their friends once people decide they are curious to learn more about the Holocaust.
I actually just want to say, so Dina is a teacher. And so, Dina and her husband actually put together this wonderful educators resource page on our website. So Dina, not to put you on the spot, but I know that you've encountered a few instances where your students had never heard about the Holocaust or had never met a Jewish person before. So I was maybe curious to know if you can, share some of that.
Yeah, so I teach at a public school, and not a very large Jewish student population, but we do have a large Armenian population, and they have experienced a genocide. So I always use that to kind of tie it in and find a connection. I have had students in the past who have said that I'm the first Jewish person they've ever met. It was shocking to me 15 years ago when I first started teaching. It's not so shocking to me anymore. It's actually, I look at it as kind of a challenge. Like, okay, great, here we go. Let's talk. And it's nice. We have connection. I also, Marissa, you were mentioning about telling the stories and things. And I find that with this project being the third generation, with a lot of my students learning something in history class, like you said, for 5 minutes that they have to learn to pass a test. It's like they learn it, they memorize it, they do the test, and it's forgotten, and they're on to the next test. And so I find that if you can take the time and make it a little more of a personal connection, it means more. So to go from history class where they're learning about the Holocaust and then come to my class, which is an English class, and we read Night and we read, testimonials, and now I show them these videos, it's a whole different game. And then of course, having a teacher who has the connection, it helps as well. And it makes it more real, rather than, not to discount the survivors telling the stories themselves, because the firsthand accounts are obviously the best. But when those are not available anymore, we used to bring speakers to our school. We still do yearly. We try to get some Holocaust survivor speakers to come to the school and speak to the students, and they love it to hear them in person. But we know, unfortunately, that's becoming more difficult to do. And so to have a resource like this where they can hear from another generation, but closer to them in age, and it's online, they can watch on their phones, and it's speaking their language a little bit more for the current, high school generation and the younger generation, to be able to access more accessible, more relatable stories to their own. It's really connecting with them. So on that level, I think for students of all cultures and all faiths to be able to have a connection beyond the textbook has been great. And they're really responding to the younger generations speaking out more as well. But it's still important to have both too, and to show them the firsthand accounts, but then also the second and the third generation accounts. And it's been really refreshing. And I've found that this resource has been great for them, besides just the textbooks, and taking it beyond just their history class as well.
Sure. Go ahead.
Me? Yeah?
Mhm.
Okay. When I was in 8th grade at Maimonides, we had a Holocaust course for a half semester, and it was immersive. So what we did was we had someone who came and worked, and they built sets for us in this little room. And every week we would have a new set, and it started with this luxurious home with space and room, and then as the weeks went on, you got smaller and smaller, and then we all had to fit into one small room. We went down into a different set, into a sewer, what it was like for the people living down there. And I remember one of the sets was, we walked in and it was all covered in silver, I think something silver, and there was a table on the roof with everything flipped upside down, and we were confused because it wasn't really like the sets that we were in, because that's not realistic. No one lives like that. But it was to show how people's worlds got flipped upside down in 2 seconds, and how, actually not 2 seconds, over time. And it took, and people didn't realize it, and all of a sudden their worlds were upside down. And I just remember connecting with that a lot, because like Dina said, is that it's hard to find a connection when you don't have a family member, because you don't feel like you relate to, I mean, we're Jewish, so we all relate to it, but you don't feel like that even more so connection. But I saw my classmates be in it and feel what it could have been like a simulation. And I thought that they connected a lot more, and they were actually able to understand it more of, wow, this was really intense. And I just thought that was a cool way of educating students in this like traumatic experience.
That's great. I haven't heard of schools doing something like that, so that's really interesting. I think it would be helpful to know from everyone if there's been something surprising for you as you've kind of gone down this journey of maybe learning your grandparents' stories in a more deeper level to be able to share them, and if there's anything that you discovered either about yourself or about your grandparents' stories that maybe you wouldn't have if you didn't do this project. If someone wants to go first.
I'll jump in. My grandfather lived in such a state of like, I lost, like I should have gotten my family out. I could have saved them. I lost my family. There was such a sense of loss. So I think from the time I was little, I wanted to find, because I wanted to make it better for him in some way. So I have always been super interested in family history and digging for records and like finding what I could find. And this project was the first time that I sat down and like chronologically mapped out his journey. Because I think for a lot of us, as I mentioned earlier, we get the stories a little here, a little there, at a family dinner, over a cup of coffee, going for a walk. Like you just don't get it in this, like I was here, then I was here, then I was here. So oftentimes I think for us hearing it growing up, it's like, well, how did that happen? Or did that really happen? Like that doesn't make sense. But in going through this journey and like mapping everything out, I've almost become, he's been gone for over 10 years, but like I've almost become closer to him now, because I could understand his decision making and how he ended up in certain positions that he did. Or like I never understood after the war, he went to the displaced persons camp and they made him the chief of police, and like it never made sense. Like my grandpa was the chief of police. Like it didn't make sense. But in mapping out his story, it made sense, because having been in the Army, he was promoted to a sergeant. He had that expertise. And it was the first time that it all really like crystallized for me. So, so there's that part of it. And then I could, for me personally, I think less so about my grandfather's story, but just filming all of these stories has changed me and the way I look at the Holocaust and the way I look at life, and really, I think even more so, as Vivienne mentioned, like the miracle of survival. So like, I feel now even more of a weight to live with purpose and cherish every moment that I get with family and be grateful for that.
Go ahead.
I also feel that listening, and Carolyn, thank you so much for encouraging us to go out and hear the chronology of my father's story and my grandparents' story. Because for me, really putting myself into the ages of when all of the, invasions started, or, as Vivienne was saying, over time, like one of the most compelling questions I feel like you asked us, Carolyn, is what was their life before the war? I think so much of us identify with the loss and the death or survival, whatever our family history is, we operate so much in a post Holocaust space. And it was so fascinating for me to dive deeper into what my grandparents' life was before this happened, and how, it was this slow, gradual demise of their humanity, which, led to the extreme of my grandfather being in two different concentration camps, my father being born in the Jewish ghetto, being very ill, having to live in a convent by himself while his mother scrambled to figure out, thought her husband had died, and being a mother, having young children, and being able to really put myself into the mindset and position of my elders was very gratifying and eye-opening. So thank you. I mean, we all just owe so much thanks to you for including.
And I would just say briefly, a lot of the interesting fact finding that's come out of this project, but also generally since my grandparents have passed away, has actually been things that transpired post war. That were really sort of elements of their prior experience. As I mentioned, my grandparents spent some time in Paris after the war, so there they were, learning a new language, which would then, be the first of two new languages they would have to learn as adults, when they came to Los Angeles. And then, my grandparents' lives in Los Angeles from the 50s on, we have, all sorts of interesting papers and records. For example, a copy of a check that my grandfather wrote after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, where he took up a collection at his place of work in downtown Los Angeles in the garment industry and sent, I think, $5,000, which at the time was quite a sum of money, to Coretta Scott King. And then the letter response that he received, and just kind of thinking about how that was really informed by his experience and his upbringing. A lot of my grandparents' letters back and forth as well, because my grandfather was in Los Angeles before my grandmother came across from Europe. And so we have lots of Polish letters that we've been getting translated. So that's been really interesting as well, and really kind of paints more of a complete picture of a time that, I didn't really know about before. And, my grandparents weren't, yes, there were stories, but, there were lots of things that just weren't spoken about. But we've been able to paint a bit of a clearer picture about those times.
That's great. And, understanding that this has been kind of a discovery period for a lot of you, is there any way that it has kind of doing this project has changed the way that you feel either in general in your day-to-day life or as a Jewish person in kind of today's world? Or is there any way that it has changed the way that you feel like you need to operate your day-to-day life, or maybe not every day, but in some interval of time? I saw a hand raised. Yeah.
Sorry. I know that I've interviewed my grandfather a few times, like from different ages of like 6th grade, 8th grade, recently in 10th grade, 11th, whatever. The point is,
you're in 11th.
I've interviewed him a few times, and I think that the main message that I get is learning to be proud that you're Jewish, and that it's something that is being threatened right now, especially if we see more anti-Semitic attacks and more anti-Semitic things going on in the world, and it's scary, and it can make you kind of doubt of like a lot of Jews in the Holocaust left their faith, and I am blown away by the ones that stuck with it, because I don't know how that's possible. But it's just about like being in this day and age, being a young Jewish woman who's like growing up and like is going to go into society soon, is that am I going to stick with it, or am I going to abandon it? And I think that what I've learned is that you got to be proud to be Jewish, because that's what's so special about this whole experience. That's what unites us. That's what brings us all together. And I think that's just something that I've taken away, that I apply in my daily life, of just kind of remembering, is that like I am a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor and the great granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, that it's in my blood to be proud to be Jewish.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else, if you want to share something that, if you don't, we can also move on to the next.
I think I'll say just quickly, along the same lines, that not just growing up to be proud to be Jewish, but, raise my family to be proud to be Jewish too. Like, I have 2 young daughters. They won't hear these stories from my grandparents. They have to hear it from me. So that's my mission, is to make sure they hear it, they know it, they love it, and they are proud of it as well. Passing it on to the 4th, the 5th, the 6th generation, never letting it stop.
Thank you.
Seeing my father witness my son have a bar mitzvah, or his granddaughter have a bar mitzvah, like those are the moments where I have felt completely overwhelmed with, like, oh, cool, they really did not win. Like, we are still doing it. We are still reading the same sacred texts and connecting on the same traditional ritualistic level that for generations upon generations has been happening. And that for me, has been, obviously, is monumental anyway to for your kid to get to that spot, but to see it through my father's eyes is pretty powerful. So yes, to everything that everyone is saying, as far as feels like that, like taking the candle and lighting the next candle and lighting the next candle is really feels like a commonality between survivors and the children of survivors.
Molly, I'm curious if you witnessed, you were probably present sometimes when your daughter was interviewing your parents. Did you witness kind of a shift over time in the way that they communicated the story to you versus the way they communicated it to Vivienne? Or even if it was not in facts, but kind of in emotion, or what they were willing to share or not share?
Yeah, I wasn't very close to my grandparents, the 2 grandparents that survived, but I'm very close to my father, who is also a survivor, and he's kind of like a historian. Like, he can just bang out the facts and the timing and the dates, and he speaks. I have always felt he spoke like a historian in retelling his story and his parents' story. I have definitely noticed there's a much sort of softer, more connected version of storytelling when it's with his own granddaughter. I feel like for me, it was always like, these are the facts. But there's been some sort of, they say that grandchildren are like the ultimate in the heart space of opening. And so I do see that from my father, that there's a different level of pride in the passing the story on to his grandchildren.
Molly, I think, I don't know if you want to share this or not, but even I think you're one of the few people here who has the benefit of, like, thank God, you were able to watch these interviews that we did with you and Vivienne with your dad. So few of us that are interviewed have that opportunity. So if there's any takeaways or anything that came out of that you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, my dad watched my interview first, and I guess this is maybe even more so why I see the softening in him. He watched my interview and he was like, very nice, as it ended. And then he watched Vivienne's interview. It makes me get emotional, and he bawled. He was bawling after Vivienne's interview. And it was like, oh God, it was just so amazing. And it was, again, that feeling of like, great, this is really the point. This is why so many people have had to you know, this is why so many people stayed present and listened and did what they were told, or stole what they had to steal, or made deals with whatever guards they had to make. It was for this moment of retelling and hearing. Thanks.
So if anyone's curious on whether or not participating would honor their grandparents, I think the answer is it would. And not most people don't have the opportunity to be as lucky as Molly and Vivienne to be able to show their grandparents or their father the interview that they've done at this point. But I think it's a really special opportunity for grandchildren who maybe want to reconnect with their grandparents, and maybe you will discover a new way or a new kind of opinion on them, or learn a new story by learning their story in a new way, even if they're not alive anymore, even if it's just tidbits. But Carolyn, I'm curious for you, when you're looking for additional interviewees, are there kind of, maybe you could share some of the requirements for what types of conversations you like to have? Is it a long, conversation? Does it have to be chronological? What if people don't know a lot of the facts, but they still want to do something? What are you kind of looking for?
Yeah, so let me just say, I am not a filmmaker. I'm a marketing person. So like, I set out on this journey with just like no sort of, I think I have some background in storytelling, and that comes from my marketing background, but with no sort of like, how is this going to go? And Erin was actually like the first person that responded. I put up a Facebook post that said, do I know anyone who are the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors? And Erin wrote back right away and said, I am. And Erin was one of the very first interviews that I did. And thank God, because we learned a lot through that process. But I think the requirement is just, you have to be a grandchild of a survivor and have a story to tell, whether you know a lot about that story or not. Like, that's really it, because the point is keeping these stories alive. So if you have a story to share, I want to film you. And I want your story to be shared, and I want you to feel like you can share it. I would say that I definitely encounter, it's not so much a criteria thing from my perspective. It's a lot more of me running into conversations with 3Gs that say, well, sure, I'll participate, but I don't really know that much, or they didn't really talk about it. Like, I hear that a lot, right? So it's less about the 3G convincing me, and it's more about me trying to like coax and convince them that like, you know more than you think you do. And even for the people that say, well, they never talked about it. I mean, my grandmother never talked about it. Like, she came out of the experience like, we are never reliving this again. I'm never talking about it. Everything is new. I'm American now. And that's it. So like, I understand what that feeling is like to not know. But I think even for those people, like John Steingold, who was a member of the 3G board for a very long time, like, he even talked about how he didn't know that much about his grandmother's story and found out a lot later in life or after she passed away. And I think even for those people, you know more than you think you do. And you observe things about, there are things about our grandparents' behavior that come up because they were survivors of this atrocity. So whether they speak about it or not, whether you think you know a lot or not, you know more than you think you know the behaviors, you've witnessed how they were with you and how they, were later in life. And there are a ton of resources and archives out there to help and assist in the journey of piecing it together.
And if someone wants to be interviewed, how should they reach out to you?
So there's actually a form on the website that they can fill out. It's a bit of a slow going process. I'm actually in the middle of filming the next round, and then I have the third round lined up after that. A lot of it right now has just been like word of mouth and friends of friends. And, Molly has been a wonderful connector for this and sent a lot of people my way, and Dina and Aaron as well. So I feel grateful for the people that I have filmed. A lot of it's been referral, but certainly I would encourage anyone to fill out the form on the website. And if we don't get to it right away, it's a slow going process, but the website is ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. And we're also on Instagram. You can follow us at if you heard what I heard.
Awesome. And last thing before we open up for questions is just what's next for If You Heard What I Heard, other than kind of the second and third round of interviews?
Yeah, I think, I sort of like jokingly say this project is like the little engine that could. Like, we're not a big foundation. As I've mentioned, I'm not a filmmaker. Like, it's very, very grassroots. So I think the biggest thing is just like trying to get as many people knowing that this project exists as possible. And I will say that I'm eternally grateful for everyone who has participated and given an interview. And I really feel like we are sort of like a band together, sort of like, aligned in wanting to see these stories live on. So I think as far as what's next, it's just trying to get this project into the school system and trying to get, today's youth knowing about it and sharing. And even, look, I'm not an influencer and I don't have that many followers, and that's okay. Even if I've posted something on Facebook and I have, let's say 200 friends, and 100 of my friends have never heard my grandparents' Holocaust story before, if I reach those people, like, I'm happy. And I would say that that's true for all of us, right, that have participated in this. It's like this ripple effect. The more people that know about it, even if we reach those within our own small or big networks, that we're making a difference.
Awesome. And so I invite people to start typing questions in the Q&A box. One of the questions that came in is, there's a lot of conversations about intergenerational trauma and inherited trauma from being a child of a Holocaust survivor or a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. And if there's any stories that maybe one of you would like to share about that experience, or if you feel like you maybe have not inherited something like that. And if it's too personal, you can skip it. But I think Aaron has a response.
Yeah, I'll generally say that I think being a grandchild of survivors, a lot of the trauma has kind of been filtered already in so quickly, so filtered out, which is terrific. I mean, my father and his siblings, have lots of stories about their upbringing, and they sort of overprotectedness and not being permitted to ride a bike, down the street, or go away for college, let's say. And I think a lot of that has by only 20 years later really kind of dissipated. So I'm grateful for that. But on the flip side, it also just shows how quickly the stories can sort of evaporate into thin air. A lot gets lost so quickly. So it just really kind of emphasizes the importance of documenting and of establishing personal connections. And so I think that's one of the critical parts of this program is not just, we're not educating the general public about facts necessarily. We're establishing connections, and we are, also just for the participants in the program, it's an amazing experience. I think Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, who was the director of Camp Ramah for many years, he's a Valley Bashalom, he would always say about Camp Ramah, about Jewish summer camp in general, that, it's Jewish summer camp is not for the campers. It's really for the counselors. It's for the staff people to, be teens and young adults hanging out all summer. And so I think in the same way, this program is, as much, if not more so, for the participants themselves as the general public. So, for that reason, I'm very grateful to have participated.
Go ahead, Dina.
I completely agree. I honestly, like Aaron said, with the trauma kind of being filtered out, I think the reason why the three Gs, the third generation, is so willing to share these stories and then do for me, this was my kind of kick in the butt to do the research, because I've always had questions and wanted to know things that I didn't know and wasn't told. But when Carolyn reached out to me to do this, it gave me a deadline. It gave me that push to get the research. My mom helped a lot in finding this information and reading the documents. And like Carolyn said, putting that timeline together. So for me, I feel like the second generation kind of held more of the trauma, being so close to it, their whole life being raised. Whereas for us, it was me more of a pride, not a trauma, not a traumatic experience. To me, I feel more proud that I could be in this position. My grandmother, I went to a number of Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles events and gala dinners, and I got to meet so many survivors. And I'm so proud of that and the memories that I have going with my grandparents to the museum events and going to the museum, seeing their names on the wall. To me, that's just pride. There's no trauma.
So we have a question from Charles. While we may know the general story of what happened to her relatives in the Holocaust, how do we check various aspects of their story?
It's interesting. My grandfather wrote a manuscript that throughout it's translated into English. He wrote it in Hungarian, his native tongue, but it's also been he translated it into English. But as the story gets more intense and the as he's telling his story, his English gets more and more broken. Because the facts become a little bit more intense for him to express or explain. And I think that there are a lot of holes in the stories that we hear. And somebody said earlier, that's like you hear little bits and pieces growing up with it as part of your history. It takes the digging. I mean, I think that's why we're also honored to be part of this project, because it forced us to actually ask for the timeline and dig for the timeline to see what the stories were. And that question is so great because it really, I feel like, puts a finger on why it's so important to get any information that we can and to collect whatever memory you have of your personal experience with your surviving relatives, because the more time passes, the less opportunity we have to fact check ourselves and the timeline of the tragedies.
That's awesome. And let's see what other questions came through. Vivienne, what does it mean to be part of the generation that will see the last of the living survivors pass on?
I have actually spoken to my friends about this, and we've talked about how scary but also important. Like, we feel two feelings about this. Our first feeling is just like, that is so sad. And it's so scary that there are Holocaust deniers while there are living survivors. What happens when there are no longer living survivors? How much more is there going to be that can be denied? And I think that's just really scary for us to think about. But then also it's, okay, well, now it's our job. Now we have to take initiative. And I know my friend, she works, I think it's at the Holocaust Museum of LA, and she's done so much work in making sure that there are events, that there are speakers, that it's talked about, because that's so important. And she knows, and we're trying to tell our grade, that it is our job. And when we learn about it in class, we always bring that up, because if we don't know that it's our job, no one's going to do anything about it. So I think that to keep telling our age and this generation that you really need to take advantage of it, because soon it will be gone. And that's so sad, but also it's so important that we should be doing this. And I know that a lot of my friends feel like they're stepping up, and that makes me feel hopeful, because if a lot of people step up, then we're moving forward. And I think that, even like Dina was saying earlier, is that the way, how do you teach this? How do you tell us that we're the last generation? How do you make sure that we know that we have so much more work to do to make sure that we're doing the right thing and that we're on the right track?
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, thank you, Carolyn, Dina, Aaron, Molly, Vivienne, for sharing your time and insights with us today. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us on Thursday at 11 a.m. for our weekly Holocaust Survivor Talk. You can also join us this week on Thursday, November 4th at 5 p.m. for a monthly series called Building Bridges, in which community leaders will discuss the critical issues facing Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi Jewish communities. You can find more information about our virtual events on our website, holocaustmuseumla.org. Also, a recording of this program will be available on Holocaust Museum LA's YouTube channel. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. So if you're enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member. To learn more about our membership levels and benefits, visit holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. And thank you again to Carolyn, Dina, Aaron, Molly, and Vivienne, and to all of you for joining us today. And again, if you are interested in sharing your own grandparent story, you can go to If You Heard What I Heard's Instagram page. You can go to their website. I'm sure there's lots of ways to contact Carolyn. I'm sure she's super responsive. So feel free to reach out to her to share your own grandparent stories as well. Have a great night, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.